just get started. Innovation is an interesting space. In order to really win an innovation, there's three key things that have to come together. You have to pick the right markets to be in. You have to have the right products in those markets, and you have to have the right business model. And what we're going to focus on today is really that first step, getting the right markets and identifying adjacencies and markets that you're in and new markets, and put all that in perspective. And what I think you'll find exciting is looking at this through a different lens, a jobs to be done lens, really adds some simplicity and clarity to what can be sometimes a daunting process. So let's just get right into it. Here's a common challenge that we see companies facing. Sounds something like this. We're currently a $500 million company. We want to be $1 billion company in 5 years. So how do we get there? So clearly companies are looking for sources of revenue growth, right? And in order to do that, they have to find sources of revenue growth in core markets, adjacent markets, and new markets. And that's often how it's talked about. So what process do you follow? It sounds like this should be pretty simple, right? Just like everything else in the innovation space, just trying to come up with solutions that address unmet needs, right? Here we're just trying to define markets and that we should go after. But the process would look something like this. Let's first figure out what are the opportunities to grow in the core market. That makes sense, right? If there's still revenue growth in the core market, let's just focus there. We're good at that. We have the capabilities. We're already in the market. That's lower risk, quicker to uptake. So let's focus on that first. The second would be then identify and prioritize these adjacent markets to go after. Theoretically here, you'd already have some built-in competitive advantage. So let's go after those next. And then lastly, maybe go after some new markets. And we'll talk about what we mean by all of this, because there's one key issue that companies face when they think about revenue growth through these core markets, and that is there isn't agreement as to how a market should even be defined. Now, I know this sounds odd, but this is one of the key obstacles to success. So let's talk about this for moments. And in fact, before I even show that, maybe I can ask you, and John, maybe you could facilitate, what are some of the ways that you define markets or your companies? Type in the chat, if you will. How do you define markets? Around what? Is it around a vertical, around a product? Just to get some ideas on how it's being done today.
All right, we've got target audience, geography, application, demographic, a lot of geographies, products, industry. We have one customer need or consumer need.
Well, there's some variation there, John, isn't there? Would you detect that?
There's some variation. Oh yeah, there's tons of variation. They're still coming in. Demographics by zone, geography. I think they've hit on all the items that are on that slide.
Yeah, so these are all great ways to define a market, aren't they? But you have to wonder, is there a best way to define a market? And this is something we often see that quite literally there is disagreement across the organizations as to what a market even is. So what I'd like to do is to come back and ask the question amongst your teams. So let's pull up the poll. Is there agreement within your management team on how to best define a market? Is there agreement? Whoa. So I'm looking at the results. They're not inconsistent with what we've seen before. Pushing about 80% that say no. We'll let it run a little bit longer. We got a good sample size here, so I'm excited to capture all the inputs that we can. And John, maybe we could close it up here. And so we've got about 78% saying no and just 22% saying yes. So that's very interesting, isn't it? I would dare to say, in that we're trying to define which markets to be in, which markets we are in, but it's not clear how to define a market to begin with. So, and this is the conclusion that we've reached over the years, is that market definition process is obscure, it's random, it's often left to chance. Some people like to define markets around a product, like the vacuum cleaner market or the espresso maker market. Others choose to define markets around verticals, such as the financial services or healthcare market. We've seen markets defined around demographics, like the people over 45 market, or technologies, like the brain sensor market, customer activities like the fitness market. We could go on, right? And that's the point, right? The point is that the market definition process is obscure, random, and as a result, innovators can choose to define markets in ways that actually cause them to churn and pivot and fail. We've been doing some work over the past few months with Steve Blank, the folks over at Lean Startup. And we recently put together an article that Steve posted on his site. And John, maybe you could put that up in the chat, the link for that as well. But what he says, what we recognize to be true as well, is that if you don't define a market up front and you go into customer discovery, you start iterating around the market definition and the product and the value proposition all at the same time. So there's nothing fixed as you're going into the equation. So the market can change, the needs can change, the value prop can change, and you get caught up in this recursive loop that you just can't get out. There's no logical way to get out of the loop. And the reason that is because there's nothing fixed in the equation, right? If you're trying to create products that will satisfy needs in the market, something has to be a constant in the equation. So our take is, well, let's make the market the constant in the equation. We need to define a market in such a way that it can be a constant. Because if we can't agree on what a market is, how can we agree on which markets to pursue? And as we see here with the audience, 78% of you say on your teams, there's no agreement as to what a market is. So let's pose the question then, well, what's the best way to define a market? And of course, this is something we've looked at for the last 30 years. And the way we thought about this is, a market is a statement that we're going to apply in the categorization scheme we're going to apply that should be useful to us in order to win in the marketplace, right? So it should be defined in a way that provides a constant, consistent basis for evaluation. If you're trying to compare a vertical to a geography, to a product, to a demographic, that becomes extremely difficult. You're comparing apples and oranges. How can you look at market attractiveness when you're defining markets in multiple different ways? You need a consistent basis for evaluation and a way to define markets where every market can be defined in a consistent fashion. So it's got to be inclusive of the entire customer population as well. Like you think about verticals, is each vertical a different market, or are they all trying to do the same thing? And maybe there's just one higher abstraction of the market that you could define that would include all the customers that are in it. A market should be stable over time as well. We don't want to pick on products or technologies that come and go because we're tying our market definition to something that's not stable. So that means they should not assume a product or a solution. They must be solution independent. Also, if we could define them in such a way that each market has its own unique DNA that can't be confused, they're mutually exclusive from other markets, that would be ideal. If this market structure would offer a framework to discover adjacent markets in a new way or better way, that would be helpful. And if it could make it easier to understand customer needs, that would be helpful as well. So with all that in mind, how should we best define a market? Well, let's introduce jobs to be done theory. The theory, as you know, is quite simple. People buy products and services to get a job done. And I would argue this really isn't a theory, it's just an economic principle. We know that people buy products to get jobs done. And as a result of that, we can make the job the unit of analysis, which means that we can define markets around the job to be done. So what we're suggesting here is instead of defining a market around a demographic or a vertical or geography or anything else, let's define a market around the job to be done. So what this means then is we can look past products because, again, products come and go. And why do we want to tie our long-term strategy to something that may disappear? Let's focus on something that's stable over time, a good focal point for value creation, like we show here. So again, instead of defining markets around personas and products and verticals and use cases and demographics, let's define a market as a group of people and the job they're trying to get done. That's a market. There's a group of people trying to get a job done. And think about it. People buy products to get a job done. Well, if that's true, there's a group of people buying products to get a job done. Let's just define the market around that group of people. So it's very straightforward, right? What we're saying is there are a group of people trying to achieve some goal. That's how we're going to define our market. Now, the beauty of this, of course, is that it allows us to create a formula to define a market in a very consistent way. Again, parents trying to pass on life lessons to children constitute a market. It's a group of people and the job that they're trying to get done. And you can notice here too, the way we define these job statements, very consistent. So every market is defined in the same way. It's some group of people are trying to achieve something in some context, right? Now, if we can define all our markets that way, we can compare them against each other, know what markets we're in, find adjacencies, all in a much more efficient manner. Here's some other examples. Interventional cardiologist trying to restore blood flow in an artery. A group of people trying to get a job done. That's a market. Cybersecurity managers trying to protect a website from cyber threats. That's a group of people trying to get a job done. Automotive engineers create transmissions to distribute engine power. That's a market. Now, given that definition, now we can start applying this to your markets and the growth. You're trying to grow in your core market, adjacent markets, new markets. So let's start applying it. Well, what are the markets that you're currently serving? Now, this is an interesting question because, again, most of you are not defining your markets as a group of people trying to get a job done, but you all have products, either products in mind or products already out in the marketplace. And the way I like to say this is whether you're offering a product or have a product idea in mind, you've already decided your market when looking through the jobs to be done lens. In other words, you're assuming that product is going to provide some function to some group of people. Now, what we want to do is to actually take you from a product view of the market, and you've all heard this, right? People want the quarter inch hole, but we want to put you in a position where you're defining the market around the job to be done. People want a quarter inch hole, not the quarter inch drill. So we're trying to go from a market defined through a product lens to a market defined through jobs to be done lens. And again, in concluding the work that we did with Steve Blank over the past few months, we created a market definition canvas. And what this does is it helps you move from a product mindset to a jobs to be done mindset. So I want to take you through this briefly. And you can download this. And John, I'm sure you'll be providing the link to this canvas as well. But it starts by allowing you to define the market in your own traditional way by the product that you're currently offering, or the product idea that you have in mind. So this is great for startups as well. If you have a product idea in mind, you've picked your market. You just don't know how to define it yet through a jobs to be done lens. So start by putting the product that you're trying to create or think about or already sell, and let's see what market that you're in, right? So the way we do this, we come over here and we say, well, who's using the product to get a job done? And we want all the different classifications of people, whether they're across vertical or demographics or geographies or anything else. Who's using the product to get the job done? We classify all those together, and then we try to come up with an abstracted way to define that group of people. And you may come up with a number of different ways to think about them. And what we want you to do is then pick that group of people, right? So we're going to pick the group of people that becomes the job executor. Then we come to the other side of the equation. We know the group of people, but what's the job they're trying to get done? They have a product, they're using your product. So the first question we have is, what is the function of the product, of your product? What job does the product or service idea you want to innovate currently get done? Now, keep in mind, this isn't their job to be done. This is the job the product is getting done, all right? So keep that in mind as we move forward here. So your product is offering some function. Then we can ask the question, well, what other products do people use in conjunction with your product? And what job do each of those other products get done? When we start thinking about this, we realize that people cobble together lots of different solutions to get, from their perspective, the entire job done. And we run into this all the time. Most products only get part of a job done while the customer's trying to get a more abstracted, higher level job done. So once we know what products are using and what jobs those products get done, we can talk to customers to figure out through their eyes, through their lens, what is the job that they're trying to get done. And then we can insert it here. So what we're doing is we're allowing you to start in solution space and end up in problem space with a market defined as a group of people and a job to be done. So let me take you through a quick example. We did this with the Bosch team when coming up with the circular saw improvements, but we didn't say we're in the circular saw market. But what we did say is that we're focused on circular saws. And then we asked the question, well, who are all the folks that use circular saws? Well, there's roofers, there's framers, there's finished carpenters, electricians, plumbers, general contractors, others, right? And we said, well, we can categorize those in a unique way. We can say they're trade workers, we can say they're tradesmen, we can say they're tradespeople, and what we concluded on is saying they're tradespeople. So that's the group of people that we're targeting with the circular saws. And then we asked the question, well, what's the function of the product? Well, they're trying to cut a piece of wood. Clearly, that's what a circular saw does. But they don't just use a circular saw. There's other products that they use in conjunction with that. They may use a pencil to mark the cut path, which is a job, or a T-square to make sure the cut is straight, and so on. So we can look at that and start abstracting it up higher. It's not just cut a piece of wood. We could say we're trying to cut wood along a path or cut wood in a straight line, and we conclude that the job can be cut a piece of wood in a straight line. Right? Again, so what we're doing here is we're not defining the market as the circular saw market. We're defining it as a market of tradespeople who are trying to cut a piece of wood in a straight line. Now, what this allows us to do, of course, is all the other points that we brought up earlier, to understand customer needs to a greater degree, to find opportunities to a greater degree. Again, tradespeople cutting a piece of wood in a straight line. The interesting thing about this is a job executed off multiple verticals, demographics, so on, can constitute a single market. So this means that you may think you're in 10 or 12 or 15 markets when in fact you may be in 1 or 2 markets. Same thing with the Bosch circular saw folks. If they thought, plumbers was one market and roofers was another, and so on, they could think there are multiple markets, but when you realize it's tradesmen cutting wood in a straight line, they just are all constituents in a single market. This helps you really simplify your product innovation efforts, the way you're organized, a whole series of things that can be beneficial. So then the question becomes, how can you find growth opportunities in your core markets? Again, we're trying to build out that market portfolio, grow the core market, find adjacencies, find new markets. How do we grow in the core market? Well, there's really 2 ways. One is we can help customers get more of the job done, or we can help them get the job done better. So let's take a look at each. In terms of getting more of the job done, what we recommend is that you create a job map for that market that you're in. And you do this by interviewing customers and asking them, what are they trying to achieve as they go about and get that bigger abstracted job done? We often will collect 10, 12 or more steps that they're going through in order to get the entire job done. And from there, you can start to see some opportunities that might exist. Job mapping, simple to do, offers a lot of insight into innovation and where you could potentially find opportunities to grow. Here's the questions that will help answer. Do our products get the entire job done? Chances are they don't, right? There may be holes that exist in the portfolio. Customers may be cobbling together solutions to get the entire job done, but there might be a product in your portfolio that holds the potential to get the entire job done. That becomes your platform level play and solution that you want to invest in over time so that you can win in the marketplace. At the same time, you can start analyzing the competition, asking the same questions. There are parts of the job that other companies are getting done that we don't get done. Those are your non-traditional competitors. What are those parts of the job? And of course, they're sitting around trying to figure out how to grow as well. So they're trying to evolve to get the entire job done over time as well. So this gives you some insight into how to position yourselves against your competitors. The job map also points out where customers may be forced to execute the job in an inefficient manner, in a way that's causing iteration, for example. If your process is doing that, your product is doing that, then that's an opportunity for value creation as well, an opportunity to grow in your core market. And from a simplistic standpoint, just marketing your current products better, that's a way to grow in your core market as well. If you can come up with a value proposition that more strongly resonates with your customers, that can increase growth in your core market. Now, in addition to getting more of the job done, you may want to get the job done better. And this is what our approach, outcome-driven innovation, is all about. It's really targeted at picking a market, understanding at a very deep level all the outcomes people are trying to achieve, often 100 or more, and to figure out where they're underserved across the entire job. So you can pinpoint with precision where they're underserved and help them get the job done better. And of course, that's going to help you grow in the core market as well. As part of the ODI process, there's a lot written about this. And John, maybe you could put something, a link up in the chat for this as well. At very high level, we define a market as a group of people trying to get a job done. We define needs as some metrics that people use to measure success when getting that job done, often totaling 100 or more. We look at opportunities. These are unmet needs that are important and underserved or unsatisfied, and needs that are unimportant and very satisfied. When we think about market segments, we discover groups of people that have different sets of unmet needs. And this is hard to do if we can't agree on what a need is or what the needs are, or which needs are unmet. But with all this in place, it becomes much more efficient to put together a growth strategy for your core market. And this is really the cornerstone of the outcome-driven innovation process. So with that, let's talk about the next part of the market portfolio creation process, which is to uncover and prioritize adjacent markets to consider. Now, we often hear questions like this. David, I'm picking on you. Hope you don't mind. We got this question that came in before the presentation began. And the way David said this, I found interesting. How do you identify promising related markets that leverage the core to create a competitive advantage and ideally a flywheel effect? That's a really interesting question, the way it's worded, because we're talking about related markets. All right, so it's related to something, maybe related to the core, but it leverages the core to create a competitive advantage. And what David's getting at is a concept that I like to call company market fit. Instead of product market fit, this is upstream. Let's talk about company market fit first. And I think what David's getting at is that there are certain adjacent markets that a company is more likely to win in. In other words, it's easier to establish a company market fit when the markets are defined through a jobs to be done lens. And this is what we're going to show you. So I'd like to introduce this matrix and go through it with you. What allows us to do is to define adjacent markets with clarity, because as soon as you say adjacent or related, you're making an assumption. Adjacent to what, right? So is it adjacent to a vertical? And so it's another vertical. Is it adjacent to a geography? So it's another geography. Well, the way we like thinking about it is that if we define a market as a group of people trying to get a job done, we've defined the core market, right? It's a current job executor getting a job done, right? Now, if we know that, an adjacency exists in this dimension here, where that current executor can get another job done. That would be an adjacent market, right? So you focus on the same executor, but you're helping them get another job done. And if you can help the same executor that you're currently helping get a job done, get more jobs done, especially if it's all on your same product or platform, then that's a great way to grow revenue. Of course, there's the possibility to go in the other direction as well, which is to say, I help people get a job done. Are there other people who are trying to get that same job done and go after new job executors? Now, the advantage here is a technology advantage, because you already have the technology, you've already invested in it, and you can get that core job done very effectively. Find other people who are trying to get that job done. A great way to grow. The way I like thinking about the other adjacency, it's more of a relationship company market fit, because you already have a relationship with that customer. Now you're just trying to help them get another job done. So this is what I like to think about in terms of finding adjacencies in a clear, clean way, because going after adjacencies is a lot easier than going after new markets. Because in new markets, the new executors getting new jobs done, you don't have a technology that can help them get that job done, and you don't have a relationship with that set of customers. So it requires the organization to create brand new capabilities aimed at brand new customers. The risk, of course, goes up quite dramatically when you're in that position. So when we think about those adjacencies and discover them, then the question is, well, how do you grow in those adjacent markets? We recently worked with a medical device company that had this exact question. They're already in the market and they were looking for adjacencies. They had one in mind and they said, well, is it worth pursuing? Can our technology do anything for that adjacent job? So what we did is we looked at the adjacent market through the jobs to be done lens and created a job map to look at each step in the job. And again, we can post this in the chat too, John. The customer-centered innovation map, our HBR piece back from 2008, goes into great detail on what the job mapping process is all about. But as you're trying to assess the attractiveness of an adjacent market, lay out the job, and then you can even quantify this to figure out, are there steps in that job that people are struggling to get done? Now, this is a fairly simple and effective survey to put together, because we're not asking about all the outcomes. We're just saying, here's the 12 or 20 steps in the job. Which ones are really important to the customer, and are they satisfied or not? And from there, we can figure out, are there steps in the job that people are struggling to get done? In other words, is there really an opportunity to enter this market in a way that we can create additional value or not? Again, they're adjacent. We already know we have some built-in competitive advantage. Now we just want to figure out, are they underserved? Where are they underserved? And then we can start thinking about our ability to create solutions to win in that marketplace. The way I like saying this is, underserved adjacent markets make excellent targets for revenue growth when defined through this lens, because you already have a built-in competitive advantage, either on the relationship front or on the technology front. So that leads us to the third way to grow, right? We've covered growing in core markets, growing in adjacent markets, and now we'll cover new markets. And again, I just wanted to point out, it's really important on how we define these markets, because we want to define our core markets, our adjacent markets, new markets, all using the same nomenclature and language. We can't define our core markets around verticals and then our adjacent markets around geographies and our new markets around demographics. This is what causes so much unnecessary pivoting and churn and failure. Right? Just fixing this one problem, the one problem being a lack of agreement on what a market is. If we can just fix that one problem, it smooths out all these issues so that you can more effectively grow in core markets, adjacent markets, and now let's explore new markets as well. One of the things I like to say is that market attractiveness is more easily evaluated when each market is defined in the same way, as I just pointed out, right? We can't be evaluating apples and oranges, right? We need to be able to evaluate each market in a very consistent manner. And this is hard to do when it comes to new markets. It's hard to identify new markets because there's no starting point. You've got a group of people trying to get a job done, but you haven't picked either. And I often get these questions. So what do you pick first, the group of people or the job to be done? Well, it kind of depends. You can go in either direction is the answer. But if you pick the job executor first, you can start evaluating what makes the most attractive type of job executor. If you go down the jobs to be done path first and say, I'm going to pick a job, well, then you should use a set of criteria that will help you pick the most attractive job. So what we've done is we've created, this was, I think, 10 years ago now, we created a market selection tool. It has about 42 different criteria in it, and you can pick this up on the Strategy website. John, you can, again, insert the link for this. That would be helpful. but it allows you to start evaluating markets from either direction. So in other words, if you want to start down the job executor path first, well, one simple question to ask is, well, how many job executors are there? Would I rather play in a market that has 3,000 people or 300,000 people or 3 million people? What is the rate of growth of those job executors? Are they increasing over time or are they decreasing over time? Which of those would be more attractive? If you're coming at this from a jobs to be done standpoint and say, okay, I want to pick a job first, maybe you think about, well, what jobs do people frequently execute versus once a year? Maybe they execute them 5 times a day, like passing on life lessons to children, for example. And what percent of those customers are underserved? Is it a large number? Is it a small number? Would you rather go after market where there's a large percentage of underserved customers? Are they willing to pay more? Or are they not willing to pay more? Is the market underserved or is it overserved? So it's these kinds of questions all coming through the jobs to be done lens that allow you to analyze markets in a fairly unique way. Now, what we're saying here is, you may want to still use some of the criteria you currently use to assess it. They may be great from a financial perspective or so on. This just adds another lens around which to think about market attractiveness and market sizing as well. So to wrap this up before Q&A, let's come back to what we tried to do here. What processes do you follow to find sources of revenue growth? Well, the first, let's discover growth opportunities in core markets, right? So we need to define our core markets in a unique way, figure out where we can help them get the job done better or get more of the job done. We identify and prioritize adjacent markets. So these are either the current job executors getting new jobs done or new job executors getting the current job done. And then, of course, we can uncover and prioritize new markets to pursue and evaluate them through the same lens. But what happens is it's this consistency across the board. Finding source of revenue growth is simplified dramatically when looking through the jobs to be done lens. It becomes much more formulaic, simplified, less confusing, less complex. And of course, if you can apply this in startups as well, when you're first putting this into play, it can help eliminate a lot of pivots, churn, and potentially failure as well.